Welcome back to episode 2 of my Photoshop post-processing breakdown series. In this episode, we're going to be breaking down the shot that you see there right in front of you. This was a daytime foreground with the exact same Milky Way file that we used in the last episode. In this episode, we're going to be building on top of a lot of the techniques that we went over in episode 1. So if you haven't seen that episode yet, I'd highly recommend that you give that a watch first because I'm going to be going kind of quickly over a lot of the techniques that I already demonstrated. Just like last time, I'm going to start off by breaking down the foreground file. This time, this foreground was actually taken at midday, not blue hour like the last shot, so there's a little more to go over here. So what you see in front of you is the foreground shot straight out of camera, and I will just, in one click, reapply all the develop settings that I applied before I took this shot into Photoshop. Okay, so just like last time, I basically only worked with this basic panel here. So little tweak to the color temperature, standard highlights down, shadows up kind of workflow that you would do with any RAW shot. And there's one extra thing here. So this foreground was shot in China, and for those of you who haven't been to China or haven't shot around China that much, basically every single photo you take will be covered in haze. That's just reality of shooting in such a polluted place. So in the raw processing of this shot, I took the dehaze slider all the way to 50. Most of the time, you probably don't want to go this extreme on a dehaze slider, but for this shot, it was pretty sorely needed. So I know that in the last episode, I recommended that you take your foreground exposures at blue hour to take advantage of soft light. It can actually work just as well if you take your foreground shots during a cloudy overcast day, because the clouds above you will act as a giant softbox to diffuse any harsh midday sunlight. So as you can see here, there's not very much like really harsh directional light that you would expect from a shot that was taken when the sun was almost directly overhead. And that's because I had this nice thick layer of blocking fog and low clouds that helped really diffuse that harsh sunlight across the landscape. As far as composition goes, I picked this frame because I like the way that the mountains in the bottom and the trees on top framed the center of the shot. The fine texture in the pine needles of the trees is going to make blending in the Milky Way just a little more complicated than last time, but using the same techniques with luminosity masking that we used in the last episode, we can actually do this still pretty simply. For this shot, we're going to be using the exact same Milky Way file that I used in the last episode. We're just going to grade it a little differently to look like a different Milky Way and to fit in with the foreground a little better. So I received some requests last time to just go over the very basics of a raw Milky Way processing workflow before taking it into Lightroom. And so if my computer can handle it while recording, I will just show you guys real quick how I would process the raw DNG version of this Milky Way file. The first thing we're going to be doing with this file is temporarily raising the saturation to 100. This is going to help us more accurately judge the color choices that we're going to be making here. So we'll first start with color balance, and what we're looking for in the temp and the tint is to strike a nice even balance in the temperature between the blue tones and the yellow tones in the image, and with the tint with the green tones and the magenta tones respectively. So I found what looks to me like a pretty good balance with the temperature and tint sliders. So now we'll just reset the saturation slider all the way back to 0 by double clicking on it. Once I do that, you can already see that this file is looking a lot more neutral in color than the version that we started off with. This is good because what we want to start with is something that's as neutral as possible that we can grade to look in many different ways. If you start off with a Milky Way file that's already been heavily stylized in terms of color balance, it's going to be tougher for you in Photoshop to further grade that Milky Way in different ways without stretching the data in ways that you probably shouldn't. So I want to direct your guys' attention at the histogram right here in the upper right. You can see that the 3 color histograms, red, green, and blue, are all pretty even within the main histogram here. This is what we're looking for when we finish processing a Milky Way raw file in Lightroom, because this kind of lineup means that you have neutrally processed your Milky Way raw file. If your histogram is still a little out of whack after your white balance adjustments and you can't seem to dial it in just with the temperature and tint sliders, there is another adjustment that you can do in Lightroom or Photoshop, and I will demonstrate to you guys how to do this in Lightroom real quick. So we'll apply a curves adjustment just to color channels that are problematic in the final mix. And in this case, I can see that the red channel is just a little too far to the right. So I'll go down to the tone curve panel and switch the channel just to red. And with this red curve, I'm just going to go ahead and drag down where it's looks like it's just a little too heavy. And so somewhere around here looks pretty good. Now, if we take another look at the histogram, looks like this left edge of the blue channel is just lagging a little bit behind the other channels. So in the same way, we'll switch the curve channel to blue and drag the left edge of the spike up just a little bit. Okay, so theoretically now this is actually a much more neutrally colored Milky Way RAW file than it was before we made these adjustments. And I think I agree. It's up to you if you think this looks better or not. Either way, these adjustments are small enough that it, if you don't feel like making these, like we can take care of this with color balance or hue saturation in Photoshop later. Now we're done with all the work that we need to do in Lightroom. So I've hopped into Photoshop with the finished file here, and I turned off all the layers except the foreground layer. Just like last time, we're going to start off by applying a really strong Z-curve to this foreground, just temporarily, in order to accentuate the contrast difference between the foreground and the sky. That curves layer, once finished and applied, looks something like this. Now that we have the Z-curve applied, and we made the foreground almost entirely black, and the background almost entirely white, we're going to go to TK Actions here, and make all the lights masks. Now that we have all our lights masks made, we're going to turn off this temporary curves layer here. We're going to flip through our lights masks one by one and look for one that gives us a nice boundary between the foreground and the background. So we'll first zoom out in order to get a better big picture view of the whole shot and just flip through these masks one by one, starting with lights 1. So in this case, I actually like lights 4 and lights 5, but I think I'm going to go with lights 5 here just because it excludes a little bit more of this midground here. So what's on screen now is the final mask from this shot after all the manual brushing and corrections that I made on the original lights 5 base mask. So I'll flip real quick between this mask and the original base lights 5 mask just so you guys can see the differences a little better. The biggest difference between this mask and the Lights 5 base mask is that I've painted in a little bit of a gradient here at the horizon. This is because with a hazy foreground, you can't take a Milky Way and make it sharp 100% all the way down to the blend line. It's going to look really weird. It's not going to look like it fits in, right? Because haze doesn't just stop at your foreground. Haze extends into the sky. So we need the Milky Way to be a little hazier towards the horizon. I did a little extra cleanup here in the foreground. Any extra white spots that you see here, some stuff in the boundary of the foreground mountain and the midground mountains, for example. But for the most part, the biggest work here was done right at the horizon. So this final mask, when applied to the sky image, looks something like this. So as you can see, this looks honestly pretty bad, but that's okay. We haven't graded our foreground yet. All we've done is created a base mask for our sky image. So if you think that this part of the sky really doesn't look that great with the clouds kind of like halfway showing behind the Milky Way, you're not alone in that. There's a reason that I did this, and that's because this part of the sky that looks kind of bad is going to get covered up by the light bleed that we'll add later. So now we're ready to grade the foreground a little more. Before I go any further, I'm going to double click first on this smart object for the foreground file. And that'll bring up Adobe Camera Raw, which will allow me to make additional raw adjustments to this layer while it's still in Photoshop. Basically, the only adjustment that I made here in Adobe Camera Raw that was not in Lightroom is that I dragged the exposure down another stop, and I believe I made the color temperature just a hair cooler. When you're done applying adjustments in Adobe Camera Raw here, you can just click OK, and Photoshop will automatically apply all those adjustments to the smart object layer that you have already in Photoshop. Similarly, if you had any other raw adjustments that you wanted to make at any point in your workflow, this is exactly how you do it. And Photoshop will automatically redraw the canvas with your new smart objects. So we'll exit out of Adobe Camera Raw now. And even with our -1 stop adjustment to exposure, the foreground still doesn't really look right. One of the big reasons here is just because it's way too saturated for a shot that's supposed to be taken at night. If you've done any legit night photography in the past, one of the problems that you've probably recognized in your foreground files is that the foregrounds are typically all very desaturated. So that's something that we're going to try and mimic here with this midday foreground. I'll be starting off with a unmasked hue saturation adjustment layer in Photoshop. So the first color adjustment that we're going to make to this foreground layer is to desaturate the foliage and the sky a little bit. So that was first done with a unmasked hue saturation adjustment layer in Photoshop. In this image, the foliage happened to fall under yellows. So I dragged those down almost by -20. And the sky, of course, pretty much all fell under blue, which I dragged down a lot further than the yellows, just because blue was pretty dominant in the image after the dehaze was applied in Lightroom. And this adjustment layer, when I flip it on and off a couple of times, looks like this. So that's already a pretty significant difference, but we're not quite done yet. The next color adjustment that I made to this image was just to desaturate this foliage that you see in the foreground a little bit more. That was done with a masked hue saturation layer, which looks something like this. The only adjustment here was a -27 adjustment to the master saturation, and I painted in the mask, which looks like this. So I can't remember exactly how I made this mask again, but I believe what I did was that I turned on this Z curve that we used to make the original base sky mask again. Then instead of constructing the lights masks, I constructed all the darks mask and probably took something like a darks 5. Once I selected the darks 5 mask, I took my tablet and I just painted over the foreground trees here and here. By painting over selection, I am restricting my brushstrokes to only the parts of the image that are selected. And so that's how I got this nice clean selection for all the high frequency textures in the pine needles. And of course, there are a couple of more manual adjustments here in the foreground just to target specific areas that I thought needed to be desaturated a little heavier. And the last step for the foreground blend, just like last time, I went ahead and applied a curves layer that darkened the foreground and decreased the contrast. That curves layer looks a little something like this and is actually completely unmasked. Now we're completely done grading the foreground, so we can move on to stretching and grading the sky. The first adjustment that I made to stretch this Milky Way sky file was a curves layer. If you're starting with a raw Milky Way file, you're going to want to use a levels layer for your initial stretch, or maybe even 2 stretches. I demonstrated how to do this in the last video, so if you don't have any idea what I'm talking about here, go ahead and watch the last video where I demonstrate the Milky Way stretching technique. The timestamp should be in the description. I applied a pretty basic S-curve to this already stretched image from PixInsight, and that curves looks like this. This probably looks really familiar to you. This is, not any kind of really special curves layer. It's a very vanilla S-curve. Because I was pretty satisfied with the contrast of the sky file at this point, I moved on to grading the sky. What you'll notice here with this sky file is that it's pretty heavily dominated by blues, but it doesn't really match the foreground this way because I desaturated the blues in the foreground. So this time, to match the sky to the foreground, we're going to desaturate all the blue tones in the sky and boost the saturation of all the other channels. This color adjustment was done with a very simply masked hue saturation layer. So if I apply that, that looks like this. The adjustments on this hue saturation layer were a boost in master saturation and a heavy cut in the blue saturation. Additionally, I boosted the yellows and the reds individually just a little bit. That brings out the nice detail here in the central core area of the Milky Way. The mask on this hue saturation layer is pretty simple. Basically, I took an unmasked soft black brush and just painted over the horizon part of the image here, because I didn't want the Milky Way that's supposed to be hazy and a little fuzzy to be super strongly saturated. And as one last final touch, I just added one more really weak S-curve layer after the color adjustment. At this point, we're actually completely finished with the blending portion of this shot. I know it doesn't look great, but we're going to put it all together in a couple layers time. Just like last time, the first step after finishing off all the blending is contrast. And Again, just like last time, we're going to be using luminosity masked curves layers for our contrast. This time, I have 4 contrast layers on the image. The first one is a simple S-curve on top of a Lights 1 mask. The second one is another contrast decreasing curve on a Lights 2 mask. The third one is a mask to boost the darkest darks a little bit, so that mask was a darks 4. And finally, I stretched out the midtones of the image with a midtones 2 mask. For contrast adjustments, it really helps if you keep the original name of the luminosity masks that you used. This way, if you make some adjustment to the blend layers here, you can apply the exact same contrast adjustments by just remaking the individual masks instead of having to reevaluate all the masks again. On this image, all the contrast layers together, when toggled on and off, look something like this. After contrast, we're moving on to dodging and burning. The burn layer, when applied, looks like this. And when we just view the burn layer by itself, you can see, just like last time, I've painted in a really strong vignette, starting in the corners of the image and moving in. This was all done freehand with my tablet. Little difference in the workflow for this image compared to the last one is that after I finished applying this burn layer, I thought that effect was just a little weak still. So I duplicated the entire layer, made this burn copy layer, and took the opacity of the copy down to 60%. And that just helped me increase the vignette effect a little bit more without having to go crazy with brushing over this burn layer. After the burn layer, I went on to dodge the foreground, which for this image wasn't much. Applied, it looks like this. And just on its own, it looks like this. So here, I've just freehand dodged some of these taller foreground pinnacles to bring out a couple of leading lines from the bottom of the frame. The last burn adjustment I have on this image is just on the Milky Way itself, a lot like the last time. Applied, that layer looks like this. And alone, it looks like this. When burning the Milky Way in this image, I wanted to make sure that my brush adjustments didn't bleed into the foreground trees here. So just like I created a selection to help me paint the mask for one of the earlier hue saturation layers, I did the same with my Milky Way burn layer. I believe for this one, I actually reused the sky base mask, just reselected that mask and painted in my burn in the Milky Way just as I normally would. But because that mask deselected all of these foreground trees, I didn't have to worry about any of these adjustments bleeding into the trees. So if I zoom in to some of the areas where the trees intersect the Milky Way, you can see that my burn adjustments stop immediately at any part of the image that's actually part of the foreground. Altogether, all of the dodge burn adjustments have the following effect on this image. So we brought out a couple of leading lines just from the bottom of the frame up. We vignetted the frame heavily in order to draw the viewer's eyes towards the center of the frame, where we have this nice Milky Way and the mountains here in the midground. And we've increased the contrast of the Milky Way by accenting the darker dust lanes in the core. Before moving on to our finishing touches, we're going to make one adjustment that we didn't make in the last video, and that's star minimization. One of the issues with wide field Milky Way shots is that the background star field can be very distracting. What that means is all these tiny little stars that you see all around the core of the Milky Way distract the viewer a little too much from the actual nebulosity of the core, which is what we're trying to highlight here. We don't actually really care about showing off all the millions of tiny little stars that are in and around the core of the Milky Way. To bring out the nebulosity of the core a little better, we use this technique called star minimization, which will actually just basically erase all of these tiny little stars. To start, you're going to zoom in on your sky and find a medium intensity but not saturated star. So in this case, I think this star is actually a pretty decent candidate here. It's pretty big. It's not completely blown out white, and it's not saturated any weird colors. Next, you're going to go to Select and Color Range. To help you make this selection, you can turn off the selection preview here for now. You're going to take this eyedropper and click the star that you selected. Now turn your selection preview back on to black matte. What we're looking for in the selection is something that selects most of the stars in the background star field, but doesn't select the nebulosity in the core. But to do that, we have to zoom out of the image. And in my copy of Photoshop, I actually can't do that while this dialog is up. But the good thing is the select color range dialog will memorize your settings if you just cancel out of it. So for now, we'll just cancel out this dialog and zoom out until we see a little more of this guy here so we can evaluate the mask. By going to select color range once again, it's memorized the color range that I selected and my fuzziness setting. Now I'm gonna mess around with this fuzziness slider until I can select the maximum number of stars without also selecting the nebulosity that you see here in the Milky Way. This is gonna be different for every single Milky Way file that you use. So don't take the values that I'm sliding around here to heart. Find something that works for your image. For this image, 30 seems like a more or less appropriate fuzziness for the selection. We haven't really selected any of the nebulosity, and we have pretty good coverage of all the stars. So we'll just hit OK now. That's going to load a selection of what Photoshop thinks are all the stars in your image. So let's first zoom in and evaluate the selection. So it hasn't done that poor of a job. We can see that the larger stars here in the background star field have been selected. Now, if I were doing this on a real shot, I probably wouldn't be that satisfied with this, but this is good enough to demonstrate the technique moving on. So one thing that you'll notice is that the selection, for example, here, hasn't really covered the entire star. So we'll go to Select, Modify, Expand, and expand our selection by, say, 2 pixels. Now, we have more or less complete coverage of the stars that we're selecting. Now that we have a more appropriate mask, we can go ahead, zoom back out. I'm going to stamp all my visible layers by hitting Shift, Alt, Command, E. And with the exact same selection still active, I'm going to pull down Filter, Other, Minimum, and apply the minimum filter with a 1 pixel radius. And to analyze the effect of the minimum filter, I will deselect the color range selection so we can get rid of these marching ants and just flip this on and off a couple of times. So as you can see, it actually makes a pretty large difference in the nebulosity of the core. Now we can focus a little more on the nebulosity of the core without having all these background stars distracting us. The last step here is to just take the mask that you have on the original sky file in the blend and apply it onto this star minimization layer, because we only want to apply this effect on the Milky Way itself and not any of the foreground. Play around with the radius value of the minimum filter to achieve a stronger or weaker effect. It's all going to depend on the individual sky file that you're working with. I find that if you have a sky file with heavily chromatic aberrated stars, so something with a lot of like purple fringing, for example, on the stars that you can't get rid of in Lightroom, you want to go with a slightly smaller radius, because the larger radius is going to create an effect that's going to turn the center of the star entirely purple. And that's going to end up being a lot more distracting than just having the stars there in the image itself. In my case, I shot this Milky Way file with a lens with really good optic qualities, and so there really wasn't that much fringing on the stars. Once I applied an automatic chromatic aberration adjustment in Lightroom, it got rid of more or less all the fringing that there was. One of the last finishing touches that we're going to apply to this image is light bleed here on the horizon to cover up this frankly horrendous blend line. When applied, here's what this light bleed looks like. For this light bleed, I applied a really strong effect in order to just completely blow out all of this blend line here. So now it just looks like there's some light pollution or maybe a very early phase moon on the horizon that's lighting up all this haze from the back. For your benefit, I will turn off the mask on the light bleed layer and crank up the opacity to 100% just to pick out some of the individual layers from this effect. So we'll start with the smallest one. This you can think of as the originating point of the light source. Creating these light bleed layers is pretty simple. We create a soft light layer with 50% gray as the filler, so it has no effect. You'll pick a lightly saturated and slightly yellowish color here on the color picker. So maybe something in this case like this. And then for your background color, you set it to 50% gray, which is 7F, 7F, 7F hex code. Then you'll take the circular gradient tool and just drag a little gradient here. What the workflow actually looks like is that you'll start with the largest gradient, then duplicate it and decrease the radius just a little bit, and repeat this process until you have an effect that's about as strong as you want. In this case, I duplicated it 5 times. Just like last time, we're going to reuse our original sky mask for part of the mask for this light bleed. That mask, when applied, looks like this. Now you'll notice that there's actually a little bit of bleed on the foreground here. And that's done with the exact same technique that I demonstrated in the last episode. So I'll go over that again. We want this light to bleed onto the brighter parts of the foreground without bleeding into the shadows of the foreground and looking super artificial. We'll accomplish that by taking a Lights 1 mask of the foreground and adding it to the sky mask. First, I'll turn off the bleed layer entirely. Go to TK Actions panel and create my Lights 1 mask. With my Lights 1 mask created and selected, I'm going to scroll back down to my original sky mask. I'm going to hit Shift, Command, and click on the sky mask icon here. Now, if I save this as a channel and we examine it, you can see that the entire sky is masked in and only the brighter parts of the foreground are. I had a bit more of a contrasty original sky mask, so the actual mask I used for this bleed layer looks a little bit different, but the process was exactly the same. I took the original sky mask and added it to a Lights 1 luminosity mask. There's one last finishing touch to this image, which is entirely optional, but one that I actually quite like. I can't show you this live just because my laptop can't really handle it, but it's this Orton Lights layer group here. To make this, all I did was I went into Actions under TKV4 and clicked Orton Lights. This will eventually bring up a dialog asking you how much Gaussian blur you want to apply. Pick a radius that doesn't halo the boundary between your darks and your light bleed too much. In this case, for this image, because of these sharp boundaries between the mountain and the light bleed, I think I selected a pretty low value of around 10 pixels. For most images, I actually apply an Orton Lights adjustment, if I do apply one at all, at around 20 to 30 pixels or Gaussian blur with my A7R2. I'll toggle this Orton Lights group a couple of times so you can see the effect that it gives. Basically, it makes the brightest parts of the image a little bit brighter, and it blurs the boundary between the brights and the darks. And so what that does is it gives your image a little more of a soft look. Okay, at this point, we're actually completely done with this edit. From here, you can just save this entire file as a PSB. I like to save a copy of it as a TIFF because Lightroom doesn't handle large document formats from Photoshop. The TIFF will allow you to pull that into Lightroom, make any last minute crops or do some soft proofing, and export as a JPEG. Usually I'll tag that TIFF in my catalog with a tag like PSB so that if I want to re-edit the shot in the future, I know to actually look in Finder and find the original PSB file instead of trying to open the TIFF. I hope you found episode 2 just as educational as episode 1. We went through a couple more advanced techniques for Milky Way blends, especially for something like a daylight blend. In episode 3, I'll be back with another daylight Milky Way blend, but we'll be using a different Milky Way file and one that was shot with a modified camera. So for those of you with HA modified cameras, you'll be able to see a Lightroom and Photoshop workflow for those files.